You're listening to WEOPAM 730, the voice of inquiry. It's time to join Naomi Bishop for Persuasion Mechanics.
Welcome back. I'm Naomi Bishop. We're continuing our examination of how doing your own research functions once method is removed. Let's continue. When agreement replaces evidence, repetition takes over. Once searching is no longer about testing, ideas begin to circulate rather than advance. At this stage, belief isn't being examined, it's being rehearsed. The same claims appear again and again. The same explanations resurface. The same conclusions are restated with increasing confidence. This is where echo chambers form. Not as moral failures, not as acts of censorship, but as environments shaped by selection. Structurally, an echo chamber is simple. It's a space where similar claims repeat, dissent is filtered out, and familiarity substitutes for verification. Nothing needs to be hidden. Nothing needs to be banned. Selection alone is enough. People gravitate toward sources that feel aligned. Aligned sources reference one another. Contradictions quietly fall away. Over time, the environment narrows. Within that space, repetition does more than reinforce belief. It manufactures confidence. This happens because the human mind treats familiarity as a signal. Ideas that are encountered repeatedly feel easier to process. Ease feels like understanding. Understanding feels like accuracy. No new evidence is required. Each repetition lowers resistance. Each exposure feels less questionable than the last. Confidence increases even as scrutiny decreases. This is sometimes called the illusory truth effect, but it doesn't require technical language to understand. If you hear something often enough, it starts to feel right. Modern information systems accelerate this process. Algorithms favor engagement. Engagement favors familiarity. Familiar ideas are shown more often. What keeps attention is rewarded. What disrupts comfort is deprioritized. The system isn't evaluating truth, it's optimizing persistence. As repetition increases, confidence becomes socially reinforced. Agreement is visible. Affirmation is immediate. Dissent becomes rare. And in that environment, doubt begins to feel unnecessary. Questions feel redundant. Contradictions feel irritating. Challenges feel disruptive, not because they're wrong, but because they interrupt a settled pattern. This is the feedback loop. Agreement leads to repetition. Repetition produces confidence. Confidence drives selective exposure. Selective exposure increases agreement. Accuracy is no longer the driver. Certainty accelerates on its own. And once confidence is socially reinforced, belief begins to shift. It stops functioning as information. It starts functioning as identity. Disagreement is no longer something to evaluate. It becomes something to defend against. As familiarity hardens into certainty, belief stops being informational and starts becoming personal. At this stage, belief is no longer just something you hold. It becomes something that says who you are. Confidence is already high. Agreement is already familiar. Repetition has already done its work. What changes now is not the strength of the belief, it's its function. This is where the idea of independent thinking enters. The phrase carries weight. It suggests autonomy, clarity, self-direction. But functionally, independent thinking isn't defined by disagreement. It isn't defined by rejecting institutions. It isn't defined by holding minority views. Those traits can appear in many places, including places where beliefs are never tested. Independent thinking, in practice, requires something simpler and harder: the ability to revise a belief in response to evidence. Not defiance, flexibility, not opposition, responsiveness. Without that capacity, independence becomes a label rather than a process. And labels matter, because once belief hardens, independence often turns into identity. Language begins to shift. Free thinker, awake, independent researcher. These labels do more than describe a viewpoint. They signal belonging. They separate us from them. The informed from the misled. The aware from the indoctrinated. Out-groups form alongside in-groups. Sleepers, sheep, programmed. What makes this structure powerful is the combination: belonging, paired with autonomy. Few identities are more reinforcing than one that says, I belong because I think for myself. It feels empowering, and that feeling is not imagined. It restores agency, it flatters self-image, it reframes dissent as courage. Questioning mainstream views feels brave. Standing apart feels principled. Resistance feels like clarity. But feeling independent is not the same as being methodologically independent. Methodological independence requires exposure to resistance. It requires the willingness to change course. It requires the possibility of being wrong. Identity-based independence does not. Once belief becomes identity, the cost of revision rises sharply. Changing your mind stops feeling like learning. It starts feeling like self-betrayal. Questions feel threatening. Corrections feel humiliating. Evidence is weighed by loyalty rather than strength. This isn't stubbornness. It's identity defense. When belief is tied to who you are, critique no longer feels informational. It feels personal. Challenges sound like attacks. Doubt feels destabilizing. Disagreement feels hostile, even when it isn't. And this is where skepticism changes shape. It doesn't disappear, it becomes selective, applied outward, not inward, used to challenge others, not oneself, deployed to protect belief rather than test it. Skepticism begins to function less like a tool of inquiry and more like a mechanism of defense. At this point, skepticism still feels active. It feels sharp. It feels discerning. It feels principled. But without method, it no longer leads anywhere. Once belief becomes identity, skepticism stops being a tool for inquiry and turns into a weapon for defense.